that we think that were especially relevant during the research in relation with the projects that we have been studying in the archive and now at the show. And one of the issues was the issue that we are talking this night, that is about the Arte Útil and its relation with the 2.0 culture and disobedience. And for that reason, we have invited for this night three key figures in the history of activism and this kind of practice. That we already have one present here, that is Carmin Karasic. And she was a founder member of the Electronic Disturbance Theater. And one of her works, Kurtz, is here in this room already, right now. And on Skype, we will have Ricardo Dominguez, that was part of the Electronic Disturbance Theater as well, but now he's part of the Electronic Theater Disturbance Theater, 2.0, yes. That is different. And we have, from him, we have the project here at the Room of Controversies, that is the Transported Immigrant Tool, that actually was this video that we were projecting screen right now is in relation with the project. And our third guest this night is in a Skype too. It's Steve Kurtz, that is part of the group Critical Art Ensemble. And as you will see, he was, this group was the first who started writing about this concept of electronic and civil disobedience. So I think that they are really, really good guests.
And I think one of the things that we want to do particularly this evening is that we've had two of the controversies sessions, but we'd like to fire them up a little bit. They've been a little bit too polite. I'd really like to focus on this question of civil disobedience as well. We did this workshop yesterday with Carmen, and one of the things that came out of it for me was really about this idea of activism not necessarily having to break rules or be illegal or subversive. And maybe it's nice to think about when is it productive to be subversive, when is it productive to break rules and to sort of disrupt the system. And when is there kind of more of a ethical responsibility to play within the rules? So hopefully that's one of the things that we can look at and talk about. So yeah, I think with that we'll start. So opinions, please. Where are you calling from?
Ann Arbor, Michigan.
I see Steve is here too.
Hey, Carmen.
Hello.
Hello.
Welcome to Ireland.
Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah. So, just Nick, if you want to repeat the question that you...
Yeah, so what we were saying, we just gave a kind of brief introduction to the evening, and also kind of more broadly around the sessions of the controversy room. This came out of the idea that a lot of the projects that we've been researching and looking at for Arte Útil bring up some quite pertinent questions. They're not straightforward in relationship to art practice, art's role within society. And one of the things that we say is the controversy session so far have been quite well behaved and quite polite. But we'd like to have some more opinions in them, some more controversy. And one of the things that I really like to focus on with this idea of 2.0 culture and civil disobedience is this question of disobedience. And when is it productive to break or bend rules, and when is it productive to stay within certain systems? So I think there's a really important, interesting question there around when to be subversive and when not. So hopefully that's something we can discuss this evening.
Okay, so would you like to start with the presentations?
Yeah, we can talk about disobedience in a way it's just great for us.
But yeah, I think it would be nice for everyone here, obviously, if we just had a bit of background in terms of what you guys are busy with or have been busy with, and then hopefully
Steve has a presentation that I think you can bring up here in a moment. And I think all of you just saw part of the video.
Yes.
So that would be the main introduction, and I could just speak a little bit to it when after Steve, and then.
The video, Rick, you should go back.
Okay. Well, I mean, one of the things is about one of the things about the Transporter Immigrant Tool project that was developed by Electronic Disturbance Theater 2.0 was that it was sort of brought to fruition by a conversation that I had with Brett Stahlbaum, a co-founder of Electronic Disturbance Theater with Carmin Karasic and Stephen Ray and myself in the 90s, was that he and his partner were developing a virtual hiker algorithm that allowed them to traverse dangerous territories in the Southwest. And they were using located media as part of the project. Well, I haven't been really interested in located media per se, which I thought was very kind of urban-based. I thought that this sort of use of a dislocated GPS system would be really interesting to develop in relationship to being on the U.S.-Mexican border. While I hadn't lived on the border before, it was certainly obvious that the territory was fraught with all sorts of political dangers in terms of undocumented immigrant crossing, the development of surveillance, and also the long history of border disturbance art along the U.S.-Mexican border, especially San Diego, Tijuana. So that was in 2007, and the project seemed to work in terms of just being interpolated into the university system quite easily. So there wasn't really a sense of disobedience. We got, I think, $5,000 from the UCSD Humanities, and it was a very straightforward project. It was called the Transporter Immigrant Tool. I wrote it that night after talking to Brett. It was going to help undocumented immigrants cross the dangerous territories of the Desert of the Real, the Douglas Highway. It would contain poetry, and then the Transdisciplinary Institute that I work in, called CalIT2, gave us $5,000 immediately to support undergraduate researchers. So it seemed to flow within a very undisobedient narrative, well supported in 2007. And so, while we certainly did have in our background dialogue that certainly this might be fraught with some questions of illegality in the way the structure of the border is framed and the politics of immigration in the U.S., we didn't really see it as a roadblock in the development of the project until many years later, 2010, when suddenly basically a viral condition, an imaginary condition about the use and deployment of the project really created the side of disobedience or imagined disobedience. So I suppose my question, and this is something I think Steve has been working on for quite a long time, is what is the level of, say, disobedience, whether it's electronic, civil, or in some other legal frame, when it is interpolated within the institution, funded by the institution, and really only comes to be disobedient once you start getting the response by other outside institutions, that is Congress or what have you. So that really what is deployed in the Transporter Immigrant Tool is one in which there is an embedded reality of the undocumented who die of dehydration or get lost. There is the aesthetic of the poetry and dislocated media, and then there is the institutional support. And it is only this kind of almost accidental, speculative deployment that really causes the friction of what might be considered an imaginary disobedient space. So I don't know if that kind of brings to the foreground the question you were asking.
Could you maybe explain what the explicitly how this shift happened in 2010? What was the event or the moment that things turned?
Well, it often happens with accidental viral media. I was contacted by an underground fashion magazine, not so underground now, called Vice Magazine, out of Williamsburg, Brooklyn. I used to know some of the writers. And so they contacted me and said, Ricardo, now you're a supposed professor at a university. What are you doing? And I said, well, we're developing this transporter immigrant tool. And they did an interview. They sent it out in their online magazine as well as their on print. Boing Boing picked it up. From Boing Boing, AP picked it up. So basically you had a viral contagion around the project that really then created this kind of sightlines of disobedience, which again were quite speculative on a number of levels in terms of the way the institution here at UCSD responded, as well as kind of the San Diego Tijuana area, and then on a more national scale in terms of politicians responding to this transporter immigrant tool as something that would dissolve the U.S. border, something that would be traitorous to the nation. So it just kind of really ramped up, and then you had Fox Media and all the usual kind of right-wing media really targeting the imaginary structures of the tool. So it was really there that the conversation then became institutional again. That is, how much money did you get? Is this what you really spent it on? Should we use taxpayer money to develop this sort of project? And I'll just end with this. I was given tenure based on these projects and funded by these projects, so it just created a paradoxical situation for the institution to sort of suddenly rewind their kind of reading of why they had given such a platform to these type of projects, which were disobedient already and thus funded for their disobedience, I suppose, I don't know, and then obviously became questionable. So,
and how did it play out?
Well, all the charges were dropped. They never really got very far.
These were criminal charges?
Well, the FBI cyber security or cyber division stated that the actions that we did, had broken certain law in terms of cyber law. The University Office of the President, the UCOP, also was trying to detenure me based on this research, and then there was congressmen who were asking about the use or misuse of the funds. So all those charges were, kind of brought to the foreground. I did have to have legal representation, but it certainly did not go to the degree that Steve had to face on a larger national scale. But nonetheless, all those things were, basically dropped. The funding we got was the funding we used for the project, and the cyber division FBI issue seemed to be off kilter in response to the project, and certainly the University of California Office of the President must have been very fragile. UCOP to kind of respond in a detenuring process. So the project continues in different ways, but all charges were dropped.
And could you explain a little bit about how the tool was used or not used,
Well, to make it very clear, the tool was developed to be a working tool. We worked with Water Station Inc., specifically in the Anza Borrego area, to geolocate their water caches, and we had to prove to them that it actually functioned, or the we finally convinced them that poetry was important for the tool. And Brett Stahlbaum released on his site, walkingtools.net, an open source code, so anybody could use the walking tool in any border around the world. But by the time that we were ready to release it, not only did we have to go through a year of investigation, but we began to get a sense that the narco war in northern Mexico had gotten really quite bad. They had taken over the coyote economies and were the immigrant housing communities felt that this sort of tool would put people in greater danger. So we never really, deployed it by immigrants in northern Mexico, the way we had originally established the project. This doesn't mean that the tool wouldn't have worked or doesn't work. The code is available for anybody to inspect. So you can see a project initiate from its kind of speculative deployment, staying within speculative deployment, but still function. And if it did not function, the water stationing group would not have really worked with us unless we proved to them that this safety tool, poetic safety tool, hadn't worked. So it was never deployed by undocumented immigrants crossing the desert.
In the real world, with real politics and real circumstances, as distinct from, within a more safe sphere of maybe the frame of the architecture. And many things have changed, including technology, including the visibility of an idea, how it can spread virally, like you said. Do you think you could produce a similar idea now? Would you be more worried about the kind of secure autocracy that there's around, or do you think you would just kind of develop a project that just showed all of that development?
Well, I think this is something that Carmin and maybe Steve can also speak to, but one of the things is that in 1990, when Electronic Disturbance Theater started doing the virtual sit-ins with the tool that Carmin and Brett Stahlbaum developed, the FloodNet, was that we decided to be radically transparent in the 90s, use our names, so that there was no hidden quality to the work. We let everybody get access to the basic code and what have you. And even though we know historically that activists and artists and everyday community has been under surveillance for, going back to the 60s, 50s, and beyond, we felt that by being transparent, we could create a different sort of aesthetic strategy of not being as concerned. If we were being watched, obviously we were being watched, and it did turn out we were being watched, but it wasn't to create paranoia in ourselves and communities in terms of developing the project. So when we developed the transporter immigrant tool, I think we followed the same transparency project. Certainly now we know that transparency is not part of the neoliberal agenda, so I'm not sure it's as useful, but certainly for the projects that we have done, that kind of radical transparency has still been invaluable, and I still think we would continue the same sort of trajectory with, of course, a greater awareness of the kind of homeland insecurities that are part of the kind of global surveillance culture. But I still think that aesthetically it's a good way for us to work. I certainly would recommend it always for others.
Thank you.
Well, good. See, we can figure these things out later. Well, I guess to start with the question of disobedience, it's always there, and it is, as Ricardo said, it's a real paradox because we are always resisting yet complicit. I mean, we're in both those positions all the time, and that goes back to the very beginning of the avant-garde, the minute that there was an idea that cultural production could be in the interest of other than ruling classes. We've been struggling with this, and the struggle is not going to stop regardless of the technologies we have. You know, certainly that's been one of the big lessons of the development of various digital technologies. But even going back to like video or anything else, the utopian ideas that this would finally allow us to step outside of institutional demands and pressures. It never really happens. You know, so the complicity I just live with. But on the other hand, the other question of when is disobedience a good idea? For a critical art ensemble, it's a question of cost-benefit analysis. You know, what are we going to get away with? And if it goes wrong, something bad happens, what's going to be the consequence? And if the consequence is just too high, we tend to avoid it. So the strategy we've always used for the past 25 years is how do we find the frontiers that have not been fully securitized yet. So you can see it in kind of the phases of our work. In the 90s, we were very interested in the internet and new communication and information technologies. But, you know, then they're pretty locked down. The cost benefit's not that good. You know, most of the things that you could do that would really have value in terms of resistance are really illegal now. You know, that's really changed. It's been figured through of how do you stop that cyberspace being used as a site of resistance, right? Happily, we can't stop organizing, right? It'll always be fantastic for that. But they are really working on putting some serious penalties on anything that could stop the flows of profit and power. So we moved away from that, then we moved into life sciences, and we stayed there for a little while, and we all know how that turned out eventually. But for a while, there was tremendous gray area. No one really knew what were you allowed to have, what were you not allowed to have, what needed to be surveilled. And so there was a lot of camouflage, a lot of flying under the radar, and for 10 years, we got to do pretty much whatever we wanted. That's changed now, and particularly here in the US. Doing biohacking is extraordinarily difficult because the FBI is everywhere. And what shocked me the most is how complicit with the FBI most of these supposed biohacking public labs are. So that situation has changed quite a bit, and you know, we've been moving off of that, and we haven't done so much in relationship of art, politics, and biotechnology anymore. So here's kind of where we're going to start today. So we've closed down two of the big frontiers that were so fruitful for a long time, and the cost of working with them is at this point so high if you're going to do something that I think has a real kind of impact. And this is where the New Alliances project came from, the one that's up on screen now. And we were just starting, how can we make different kinds of social arrangements, and in terms of urban-rural, in terms of interspecies relationships, in terms of extra-legal relationships. How do we put things together so they can have a different meaning in the world and function in a different way in the world? And one of the things that we got interested in was endangered species and their legal status. And so what we thought was, well, you know, what could be done is there could be a relationship between various environments that were under threat of overdevelopment or gentrification, or the many ways that people lose commons, right? Where the commonwealth is done away with and so. So, you know, could there be a different kind of relationship? And what we tried, we've only gotten to do it once because the planets really have to line up to to do this project. And there has to be perfect alignment. And what we thought we could try is if we could take an endangered species, grow it, and then use its legal status to protect other environments that are under threat, whether it's cultural center, community cultural centers, or urban gardens, or whatever, squats, and that we could plant these plants and then use them as kind of barricades, saying, hey, look, you can't come and destroy this property as it is because there's endangered species here. Right? They're protected. You've got, that there would be a way to put the legal system into action to put a stay of destruction on places where the powerful are pushing out the powerless, right? And to use the power of these species. Now, it's really hard to do because the first thing you have to have is an endangered species that's been domesticated and that can live in a localized environment where you're working. And that was difficult. Where New Alliances started was in Turin, and in the Piedmont area of Italy, there's a lot of endangered species and there's a lot of ones that have been domesticated. In this case, we used Cupid's dart. So it's a very beautiful flower. You can see it on the screen. But we needed more alliances than that because we had to figure out how we're going to grow this. Not everyone has the time. Where are you going to grow it?
Sorry to interrupt, just to check, we're on New Alliances 205, that's what we're seeing. That's correct.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
So you can see more.
Yeah.
So this is what's going on here is a workshop of volunteers of New Alliances to figure out how to grow this plant. And we have to do it through, you have to follow the natural cycle. You can't do this in greenhouses or the plants will not survive. They'll never make it through the transplant in their first season out in the wild. So you have to raise them as wild from the get-go, which means you're tapped to the natural cycle of things. So we have to have localized information. We need a farmer, which is who is speaking to us there, and teaching everybody how to grow these things. And you can see, so we have plenty of seeds, and we could do it without going and harvesting any wild plants. There was already a domestic seed bank of this particular endangered species. And then after that, it was just a matter of people wanting to take care of them, and then transplanting them. And oddly enough, Parco Arte Útil, where we did this project, the museum itself came under attack. We found ourselves planting a bunch of them right there because they were afraid they were about to lose all their funding and basically having the land around it taken away. So it was an interesting irony how that particular project stopped, and it's still ongoing. We wanted to do the same thing in New York, and to do it to protect properties against eminent domain and legal moves by energy companies to take people's land to be able to frack on, which is extract a really messy way to extract natural gas from the ground. We've never been able to do it because we can't find a plant that will function in the environment that is also endangered. So, these things are always more difficult than we thought. And there's the second problem, and that is we are still disempowered in terms of capital, right? The oil companies, we were doing it against them, or if it was back at Turin against the city council, they have lots of money, and they have lots of lawyers, and we don't. So while we can make a legal problem for a little while, ultimately, we're going to lose that fight simply because we don't have the money to buy the legal system. So we have, plan B has always been to just do into a spectacle, because one thing that seems to really generate a response is when people watch videos of endangered flowers being run over by bulldozers. So it gives us a chance to kind of make a secondary type of resistance. And though I think, we had more hopes for this plan than worked out. Ultimately, it's only a way to buy time. I think this project functions as a very good way to give you a kind of introduction into the kind of problems that we're dealing with all the time, no matter what the form of resistance or disobedience is. It's, that it's asymmetrical, that you have to sit there and, stay off the radar the best you can until it's time to get back on again for action. And getting things to line up. I mean, it's really one of the problems when you're also at the same time in your disobedience trying to be ethical. It really puts you at a disadvantage. Once again, it's another one of these terrible asymmetries we have in dominant power. So I'll wind it up there so we can get everybody talking and can go back to the dialogue.
Yeah, I mean,
And it's really a continuation of avant-garde.
but when you're dealing with plants and natural cycles, as you say, you can't really cheat that system.
Yeah, no, you can't cheat it. It would depend on what you were doing, but at least in this particular one where we need the plants to function in the wild, yeah, you have to keep them within the cycle level.
And what's this image you're showing now?
Oh, that was one of, how we were looking at test gardens at the time in urban areas. Us wandering around, scouting different areas. But I guess we did all of this scout work, and then it turned out where we really needed to do it was right back where we started at the point of origin of the museum. Anyway, we can close that out.
Would you like to mention something about the free range for grain? That is a program we have in the exhibition right now.
Yeah, free-range grain was not really meant to be an act of disobedience. It was a gesture to make people understand their stake in food distribution and to really try to be able to introduce folks to a conversation that they don't generally have, right? This wasn't made for activist specialists. This was made for a public that doesn't think about food origins all that much. And what we were most concerned about was having them understand what is it going to mean when a handful of companies, multinational corporations, control the food supply. What is that going to mean to you personally? What is that going to mean to political systems? What is that going to mean in terms of the leverage these corporations will have, particularly for imperial projects? Now, when you try and just talk to someone about it, most people are really not interested. And so we had to find a way to bring people into this conversation. And one of the ways we could do it was to test and be able to tell them, does your food contain genetically modified products? That did seem to get a lot of people's interest. And we were also, at that same time, and this is maybe the disobedient part, if there is a disobedient part to this project, was to have a public laboratory for people to really be able to see how molecular biology works. What's going on, that it's really not like the X-Files or the way they imagine it. It's really just incredibly dull and boring cooking in which little bits of liquids get moved into other little bits of liquid. And once you've done it enough in this purification process, you can read a genetic output. That did not go over very well with the authorities. Right? This has always been one of the problems with biotechnology and working with it. Because unlike with computers, it's ubiquitous computing. We're all used to it. We see computers everywhere. And though, we're looking at Ricardo right now, he could be like totally hacking someone's bank account with it, but we don't think anything bad about it because it's Ricardo and his computer. It's probably fine. Unfortunately, with biotechnological hardware particularly, and wetware, No one ever sees that, right? No one has kind of a personal relationship with it. And what they do understand about it is pretty much the fear-mongering that has been deployed by the government. And so when they see it, it's got to be used for something terrible. And that's why we were really interested since the mid-90s of getting these labs out in public, right? Where people could look at them, see them, and, you know, build a different kind of relationship to them other than one of fear. And that particular mission was really not popular with the US government. They did not appreciate that idea at all. You know, the notion for them was that this kind of activity should remain in the hands of specialists where it can be easily surveilled and that we know precisely what is going on and it's being handled by people that are completely invested in the system. So our argument for amateurism and our argument for public nature of what had always been a closed-door activity, that was considered disobedient. I mean, I don't know why, especially when you think in the history of the US, particularly there was a time when people were encouraged to have home labs. You know, that changed, and changed very drastically this century.
And that was the sort of active exposure more than disobedience.
I definitely would not put it in the frame of the disobedient projects we've done, like say more along the lines of new alliances. That was, I consider it a subversive project, but not a disobedient one.
Okay, so, hello, my name is
Did you guys see?
Oh, wow, that's really tiny. How can I see that?
Right, okay. This is about as good as we get, I think, in our amateur technology.
Anyway, my name is Carmin, and thank you for inviting me to speak with these awesome men who aren't on the screen right now. Sorry about that. I've come here to talk about FloodNet and the Electronic Disturbance Theater 1, version 1. FloodNet is the artwork that's right over here. And basically, if you were to watch the video, you could see Ricardo and I tell you about it, but I'm here live, so I'll tell you a slightly different story. Yesterday, as Nick pointed out, I was here to lead a workshop that encouraged people to think about activism from different perspectives. Today, I'll talk about activist actions from a long time ago and try to give you some idea about how they have changed, what are some of the differences now. But before I do that, I'd like to just tell you a little bit more about myself as an artist. I live here in Eindhoven. I am an artist. I am also an educator. Most of my artwork is using some sort of technology. For example, this piece, which was included in the 2011, is called Exquisite Zone, and I made it with Walt Gallagher, who's sitting here. I do a lot of my artworks with him. It used mobile devices to draw graffiti real-time on this facade. It's about a 40-foot wall in front of the Cadastre building here in Eindhoven. As an educator, I work for Lesley University, where I teach and design online courses. I also work as an educational advisor for Bolton Laboratories, which is here in Eindhoven. So what's FloodNet? FloodNet is an artwork that was developed to allow for online demonstrations, basically virtual sit-ins. Back in the late 90s, I was probably best known as the female in the Electronic Disturbance Theater. And basically, one of the reasons that we were very interesting is that we worked together without ever meeting face to face. The founding members of FloodNet were Stefan Ray. He was in Austin, Texas. Myself in Boston, Massachusetts. Ricardo in New York City, and Brett in San Jose in California. So if you think about that, basically we were kind of all around the U.S. and we only talked to each other via email
being online and use the internet for demonstration. I personally define activism as a policy of hacking or creating technology to meet a political goal. But EDT-flavored activism was really based on Zapatista solidarity. We were inspired by Ricardo, who sent out millions of really long emails. And he explained, he's the person who got, I was already pretty much into civil disobedience, well, not civil disobedience, but human rights activism. I was already doing that sort of thing, obviously joining street demonstrations, that kind of thing. But Ricardo introduced me to the idea of the Zapatistas, and I was really fascinated by the fact that they were already using email and websites and newsletters to bring attention to the low-intensity war that they were fighting against the Mexican government. I got involved with electronic civil disobedience when the Arte Útil massacre happened just before Christmas in 1997. At that time, 45 women and children were killed during a prayer meeting, and they were killed by the paramilitary with support from the funding support and investment support from the US government and European funding. And they were killed apparently for their support of the Zapatistas. So I wanted to do something about the Arte Útil massacre, and I began working with Brett to develop FloodNet. FloodNet brought two things together. It brought together code, but it also brought together social art. And basically, Brett wrote a Java applet that does a reload request. It goes out to a targeted web page, and then requests that page, reloads that page in our website several times per minute, and so that people know it's working, we load the page in the bottom of FloodNet. Ricardo and Stefan wrote basically the narrative content for FloodNet that gave it its story, and so the text that you see in the middle is the sort of thing that Ricardo would have been writing. But my role was to do the HTML and to actually develop the user interface, and so give FloodNet its look and feel. I did all of the coding for the website, and I also did all of the artwork for the website, which I know today is like pretty old, but come on, man, this was like 1998. This is Netscape 3 for crying out loud. Excuse me?
Retro.
Yeah, that's right. This was really cool. So in a nutshell, the way that it worked was we sent out a message before we were ready to do our action. And we asked people to wait until a particular day, click a link. When they clicked that link, this web page would load. And as soon as you loaded this web page, as soon as you went to our URL, the Java applet started running, it automatically started loading whatever web page we had chosen to target at the time. One thing that's kind of interesting to note, and Ricardo did allude to this when he was talking, is that we were not subversive. Everything we did was basically before the curtain. We used our real names. As I just said, we announced the FloodNet action even before it happened. We didn't hack any websites. We didn't change any data. We didn't invade anybody's databases. We didn't do any of those things that would normally be considered hacking. And so, because the word activism didn't exist back then, we basically said FloodNet is art. It's not hacking. It's a conceptual art. The very first FloodNet happened in April 1998, and we targeted President Cedillo's website, the then President of Mexico. We targeted his website. From reports, we found out that we had 8,000 international participants. That's actually enough people all trying to get to this website at the same time to cause a delay, a disruption, to make it so that you couldn't actually reach the website. And when that happened, you saw a message like this that says, the server may not be responding because it's too busy, try again. As soon as you clicked OK, in all of the cases with FloodNet, that page came up. So we never actually completely blocked access to a page, we only temporarily blocked access. And that's basically the same model with Civic. live Civic, in a physical Civic, people would block an area for a temporary amount of time, and then they would go away, and traffic can flow freely again. To me, the most interesting part of FlightNet was this sort of secret thing that happened, which was we allowed for 404 messaging. 404 is, when the file's not found, you maybe type in the wrong URL, or you go to a page that no longer exists. We have a mechanism within FlightNet for you to send a message directly to a host server. So a host server for a Mexican bank, or the White House, the US White House, or the Pentagon, or whoever you wanted to. When you typed in a word like peace, and you chose a destination, like a Mexican bank, you would then get a 404 message. And the message would show up on the administrator server, the host server, that says something like peace not found on this server, or justice not found on this server, or human rights not found on this server. And to me, that bit of conceptual art was actually the heart of FlightNet. That was the thing that I personally loved best. So, with so many different tactical technologies available to people these days, it's pretty easy for things like activism to grow into other areas. And so, although this was an artwork, FlightNet was an artwork, at this point there are lots of kinds of activism, as Nick pointed out earlier, that aren't necessarily art, they aren't necessarily subversive. And I just wanted to take a little bit of time to just show you a couple of other activism artworks. This one is called The Toy War, and this bit of activism came about as a battle between a digital toy company called eToys and an art group from Switzerland called eToy. So basically what happened is the toy company, the digital retail store, became angry because this art group did a spoof on their website where they had this, they considered it soft porn, but obviously it's not. They got a court injunction against the art group and had them remove their website. It made the art group's website come down. So in retaliation, there was a huge war that was led by internet activists, where we used denial of service attacks. So that's basically a FlightNet. We used some modifications to their database, this is outside of FlightNet. This is where you actually go into the database and have the database do activities over and over again until it really brings the database down. And email campaign and that sort of thing. In the end, the toy store dropped their charges, and the artist's website was back online, and it's noted as the most expensive performance in art history because it cost $4.5 billion. It cost this retail company $4.5 billion. So in that respect, it's pretty significant what activism can do in the real world. So clearly, activist actions are moving from the street onto the net. And when you think about it, there are a lot of advantages there, because when you move onto the net, things like how far away people are, that doesn't matter. Like in a physical demonstration, how many people can fit into a particular location, that's a clear limit. How many people want to be there, but they can't for various reasons. How big is the physical, how big is the physical space, so that even if you have a lot of people, they can't all fit, and so the demonstration seems to be smaller than it is, and so on and so forth. Whereas when it's online, you don't have to face these issues. Even so, it's still very important to have the online activities, because, have the physical activities, the street activities, because when you have an online demonstration, the people who are not part of that demonstration don't really see it. And so it has a very limited, even though maybe more people, maybe it's worldwide, but it's still very limited. So street activities are important, and I want to bring up an example of a street activity that was in conjunction with the Occupy Wall Street event in 2011. The person who wrote about this event did a much better job than I can, so the work, and it's called Brokers and Police for the Occupation. And here's how it worked. 2 members of the Yes Lab brought a dozen thrift store suits and asked for volunteers. Then, within earshot of the police, the group made a human microphone announcement about a highly risky and very arrestable action. Then, together with a brand new police escort, the group headed towards the Wall Street Bull, chanting, "Castrate the bull, castrate the bull," and other angry slogans. More police joined. Finally, the brokers reversed the empty pizza boxes they were holding and held them up to reveal the message for the 2 dozen photographers present. Police and brokers for the occupation. And at least a few of the photographs were shared on Facebook thousands of times. One of the photographs also appeared in a Long Island newspaper in an article about police overtime. So you can see this is to me just a really brilliant use of hacking the system as opposed to actually using code. So hacktivism today is maybe a little less concerned with some of the old political issues such as sustainability or the environment, and more concerned with things like security, privacy, and data access. An example of a more current hacktivist artwork is this one, Face to Facebook, by Paolo Cirio and Alessandro Ludovico. And what they did was they hacked into Facebook and they took 1 million profiles along with the pictures, and then they created another website, a fake dating website that matches people based on just their facial characteristics. They did this to highlight the fact that Facebook is actually taking your data and then claiming it to be their own. And so again, it's the same matter of hacktivism where they're trying to raise awareness about a particular topic, but in this case it's a more current topic, the topic of personal data. So EDT more or less created a form of online synchronous mass protests, but we only paved a path. And today there are lots of ways to express yourself online or to have protests online. But even these ways are still quite flawed in terms of freedom of speech and freedom of expression. For example, Facebook and Twitter, they lack the basic data protection. And as I just said, Facebook takes your data and then claims it to be their own. So even though we have lots of other tools, there still needs to be quite a lot more work in terms of finding good, strong ways that are sustainable for electronic civil disobedience. Anyway, that's pretty much it. Thank you.
Yeah, to answer your question is critical art ensemble stops. Like I said, we go with cost-benefit analysis. Once something is going to be, you're going to get very little victory and you're going to get a lot of potential discipline. We'll move off. Does it mean that nobody should do it? Well, no. But, you know, this is about what we do, and what we do is to try and find these new territories, these new areas, and wherever we think we can get the most done, that there is a tactical possibility being presented to us, an opportunity that is really exploitable, and to get in there and exploit it. And hopefully, you know, to lead other people to it. To say, like, here's this place where we can get things done that can have a real impact. So that's always our goal. Just because we leave somewhere and say, well, okay, that kind of the sides are set, it's going to be trench warfare now there. Just because we leave it doesn't mean you don't think resistance should continue. Resistance should continue in every institution and in every system. You know, whether we're talking about an interspecies relationship or whether we're talking about being in jail. Even if you're locked up, you can continue to resist by certain means. There are certain undergrounds in the economies of jail. You know, so always continue. But what we did and what we think we're good at doing is finding opportunities. And so that's what we're always looking around for.
But maybe that's also where there's, that's where the kind of the art component comes in the fact that perhaps if you stay in this kind of resistance where things are closed off, you're reduced, as you say, to kind of trench warfare or an activism. If you're going in to find these loopholes, find these areas where you can have an effect, I suppose that's almost the artistic gesture.
Well, it's one of the things we use as camouflage, yes.
Well, I think one of the elements that is important in terms of tracing the histories of tactical actions that have to move on and strategic actions that have to remain with a certain circumference of gained territory. One of the questions that I had was how can you mobilize these histories of tactical media within the institution? Say that you are now embedded within a transdisciplinary research center like Arte Útil, California Information Technology 2, and they have brought you in to do electronic civil disobedience and activism, border disturbance technologies as the research that you'll be funded for. And so tactically you would say, well, what is the next area to really begin to deploy new work, right? And so, for instance, for VanLab or Electronic Disturbance Data 2.0, the area is around nanotechnology and nanotoxicology. During the late 90s, as electronic civil disobedience in the way that Carmin has defined it and the work that we did had really rolled out into this larger notion of hacktivism, was could we or I, as an autonomous artist, gain access to the equipment necessary to investigate something like nanotechnology, to intervene into particle capitalisms, if you will. I would go to Warhol Foundation or corporations or the military and they say, no, go away. You can't have access to equipment that is, invaluable or what have you. And so you have an institution like Arte Útil that says, well, we'll make a deal with you. You do electronic civil disobedience, activism, border disturbance technology, and we'll give you a nanotechnology research center that you can have access to. All right, so, again, the cost benefits that perhaps Steve was alluding to is that one of the benefits of the strategic institutional setting is that one can gain access to certain levels of research equipment that might not be available on the outside, as usually at this point in time. So one of the qualities or outcomes of disobedience within the institution was not only that you had all these kind of legal breaks and chilling effect, but the outcome was that they gave me more funding. And then they gave me a larger laboratory to develop these kind of nanotechnology interventions. So one could say, well, is that the positive end of a strategic institutional use of the histories of tactical work? Does it have to be outside, or at least in the liminal space most of the time? I'm still not quite sure to that degree, right? The other aspect is, in terms of aesthetics as camouflage, this is where I would disagree with Steve to a certain extent, or let us say critical art ensemble more specifically, is that one of the main questions the lawyers at the FBI and all these communities, even UConn, would constantly come back and say, is this art? Is this really art? That was a consistent question. And if the answer was, for them, outside of whatever they expected, then they would pursue whatever legal landscape they wanted to create. And even within my own lawyers, the internal question to them, even though they pretended to be very hard spine for the other lawyers, was, you know, is this really art? This doesn't look like art, doesn't smell like art, you know, it doesn't taste like art. And so one of the outcomes of this was that ultimately, say, the transporter immigrant tool was afoot in an exhibition at the Contemporary Modern Art Museum up at the top of La Jolla in California, right? So my own lawyers then said, we know where La Jolla is. It's up there in the hills. We know that there's a museum up there. So my own lawyers then said, so it must be art. And then they said, how much did you pay the curators? Or how much did you pay the museum? And I said, well, in my little world, my interface with minimal the art market is there's curators. You don't pay them. They sort of decide on their own what they want to do. You may disagree with them or what have you, but they are the filters within the museum as to what is presented or not presented. So ultimately, my legal team felt that they could then strategically face off with the other lawyers on the other table and say it is art. And I would say that 90% of the collectives that I have worked with, in one way or another, have said that they are artists, working within the structure of the exploration of aesthetics, whether it's in the post-contemporary manner or in the social practice manner, but always within the regime of art. And then, and I'll end here, so aesthetics really became important in navigating, not as camouflage, but as the main structure. I'm sorry, my son is making a performance art under the table, so hold on a second, hold on. So one of the questions that was always asked about the work, say the transporter immigrant tool, moving from a local positioning system to a geopoetic system, was why we did that. And one of the things is that we also saw the border as an aesthetic project between two nations, which themselves are aesthetic projects, which create perceptions of feelings, affects, what have you. So the ground or ungrounding that a lot of the work plays with now is not to camouflage the project as art, but to really dig into its experimental zones, both tactically and strategically, as in conversations with this wider notion of expanded aesthetics, where we can begin to see not only the artwork or the persons working as artists, but entire nations and borders as aesthetic fields, where we have these conversations. And I'll end with this. When Fox News contacted us, and they always contacted us, it's a right-wing media, saying, you guys have to tell us about this traitorous application. Amy Sarah Carroll, the poet of the group, said, we're not going to have a conversation with Fox News because we disagree with your aesthetic. And so they became very confused as to, usually it would be we disagree with your ideology, your economic, political ideology, but aesthetics then became a site that was opens a different sort of conversation. So when Border Patrol stops us and they say, what are you guys doing? You're developing a traitorous application, we would say, no, it's a geopoetic system in which aesthetics is a sustenance, or, the aesthetics of the undocumented. So I guess it's just a long way to say that the camouflage aspect, which I certainly think is part of tactical media, I think shifts when one starts to think of, at least for me, in a strategic manner, of how to navigate these sort of relationalities between a university, a research center, the border, and a gesture or project.
But I'm glad that you mentioned it, because actually I wanted to ask Steve directly about the role of aesthetics in his work, because it's a question that is all the time circulating around Arte Útil too, and it's quite interesting because I think that it's more difficult even to understand the role of the aesthetics in the tactical media practices. So how do you describe, for example, this in the New Islands project, for example?
Well, aesthetics means to an end. They're a way to navigate communication conventions. Because, ultimately, a critical art ensemble has never been all that interested in subjective judgment, and particularly subjective judgment that kind of Ricardo was talking about just before, that comes from an elite source, right? I mean, aesthetics are one of the strongest meta languages of Western culture. They never come from the ground up, they always come from the top down, and are defined by the few. So, for us, they're just something that you appropriate and you use because they can be made into a convention that communicates to people. I mean, even when we say something like art, everyone has their kind of associations with it, and we're able to exploit that. You can see it a lot in the way we design projects, right? There's no critical art ensemble style of design. We use whatever the design system is that is relevant to the issue. So if we're doing something on medicine, we go look at all the medical sites and we copy what they do. Or if we're doing something on energy, we go to all the energy sites and we copy what they do. Right? The aesthetics just help to lubricate our message. So for the most part, I'm not so concerned about them, but they have to be there. Because it is one of the foundational points of communication, right? There's really a kind of no escaping them in that sense.
I want to keep banging on about this idea of disobedience.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm really trying to understand when it pays off to be disobedience. I mean, I think we've all kind of been quite affected or inundated with the NSA files of this leak. I mean, this was kind of deemed the most disobedient action because it happened with this kind of result of a huge analysis or reanalysis of how surveillance function works. Kind of small acts of disobedience can just be viewed as sort of petulant or childish. I mean, is it really a case of kind of the ends justifying the means? Or, how does one kind of negotiate?
You want to direct the question to somebody?
Open up to the floor. Maybe we can't Google each other.
Not an art. I mean, I think the ends did justify the means. Maybe I can give we should all just name ourselves. It's like you guys know who's talking when. I think what's really interesting idea about disobedience, there's also a huge romance about disobedience that I think we need to unpack a little bit sometimes, and especially when what you refer to in relation to the whole tradition of the avant-garde, And I remember thinking about what Travis Franklin said a long time ago to Phoenix. He was doing a kind of study about a lot of black ops and decoding sort of budget money in the States and trying to think about a lot of secretive information somehow. And he said, one of the things I really want to do, I could spend hours talking about the pressure I'm under not to do this stuff, but I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to glamorize that situation. I want to, if anything, make it really alive. And so sometimes I think this notion of disobedience, because it's an action, we have to be very careful about the language of aesthetics and the tradition of art that suggests that disobedience is the only gesture.
But I think there are times, okay, this is Carmin's opinion, there are times when you have no choice.
For sure.
And you absolutely have to play the disobedience card. And those are the times where your back is against the wall. And obviously the powers that be are in so much control and limiting your actions so much that there's nothing else you can do. And so you had, for example, the civil rights movement, just to make it a clear example of what I'm talking about. There are just cases where you absolutely have to break the law to make what you're trying to do, to get people to understand how important what you're trying to do is.
No, for sure. And I think if you look at the way Arte Útil is framed as a show, I mean, this is, an idea that was conceived of by Tanya Bruguera, artists who want to think about, whereas, again, maybe a bit of the tension between exactly what both Ricardo and Steve are talking about, maybe the place of art in this. How would we name this art? Why would we name this art? And many of the artists in the show think about art as camouflage, as alibi, as a zone to kind of push things through. And what I think is really interesting in the show, it fluctuates between the tension of the fact that the art institution is both the alibi, but it's also the place that gives it a kind of legitimation. And though if I'm hearing from you, Steve, I'm not sure that legitimation counts for much in terms of practice. It's not very strong within society.
Yeah, so that legitimation is quite easy to undermine. I think we heard the same thing from Ricardo too, of like how quickly something that within a university is framed as a legitimate activity that should be funded and promoted can all of a sudden be flipped into crime. This is a problem that we have because our legitimizers are not very strong legitimizers, right? I mean, the art world is definitely not known for being able to put a stamp on it and people go good. I've never ever heard of anything along the lines of, oh, we have an energy crisis or there's climate change. What do artists think about it? Let's go to the museums and find out. No, it doesn't happen. So, yeah, the legitimation is somewhat weak, and it's pretty easy to undermine if there is a power that wants to spin it another way.
Great.
Well, so one thing that I want to comment on, I think, is, I'm sorry, I'm Lori Jo. Well, first I should say that, I feel totally unqualified to talk in this forum because everything we've done is so low-tech and so inept technologically that I'm just the opposite of these people. But I wanted to talk to the theme that was brought up about the romance about disobedience. Can you just say one more sentence about that will allow me to say what I want to say?
I hope so.
No, I can say it. I'm just curious. I want to hear you say a little bit more about that because I really want to respond to that idea.
Yeah, it's maybe a very banal over-rehearsed cliche also, but I was just interested. The first thing when we were talking to Trevor Packer, we did a studio visit with him a long time ago, and of course I wanted to know about his clashes with the law, and they're always interesting anecdotes. You kind of get caught up in that story, and that story of the rebel, the artist as rebel in a way, is maybe not the story of work.
Yeah.
And so I suppose it's just that, and we so easily get attracted to that story rather than, of course, as Carmin said, there's absolutely legitimate and many interesting ways in which we should do great law, or find ways of and everything else, and this is what we're trying to explore.
Yeah.
But it's not, I'm just really more bored by the rehearsal of the romantic protagonist, and much more interested in actually when you guys were all talking about notions of strategy, tactics, the reading of how these institutional operations actually do work in society. And I kind of wish many more art practices would be as rigorous about understanding and analyzing.
Okay, that's perfect. Let me talk now. That's what I wanted to say. The thing that I have learned from Steve and these folks already in my past life, and I think we all agree, is that what you do is you look at the problem you have and then you decide on tactics based on that problem. And that's what everyone has described today. There's a cost-benefit analysis. What is the tactic we need to do what we're trying to do? And of course the targets are different in all these examples, and the targets are always different, and perhaps people even disagree on the targets. But the interesting thing about our campaign, which was this 7-year fight to reform our closed supermax prison, which our governor eventually closed this year, but which may be reopened next year, depending on the result of the election. We ended up going in this, we're just the antithesis of this story because we had a very hyper-local problem. We had a prison with any kind of universal support or, you know, hacktivism or anything actually just means absolutely nothing to the power brokers in Illinois. The only thing that matters to them are their constituents and that kind of public pressure. I mean, we did call Amnesty International in, and that helped, but it mainly helped us convince our allies to do something about it. It didn't convince our enemies. And so we ended up with this very hyper-local problem. And this is where I was going to talk about this idea about the romance of disobedience, because, you know, lots and lots of people who work on prison issues want to have rallies and, you know, they want to do the very dramatic stuff that is very visible and aesthetic and, you know, fun in a way. I mean, it's social, you're doing something, versus saying, who's our decision maker, how do we influence the decision maker, or the people who will influence the decision maker, and do that incredibly boring hard work of organizing. And that, the last thing I'll say about this, which gets to the technology, is like, my friend who works with prison groups all around the United States says the one thing that all family, you know, most of our family members don't even have internet at all, you know, or computers or whatever, so. But he says the one thing that all prison groups have in common in the 50 states is the worst technology, you know, practices and whatsoever, because we're just poor, nobody has computers, etc. So when we finally started using this technology to, you know, contact legislators in this particular way that makes it easier to make contact with them, we started talking to legislators and finding that, you know, they actually ignore every single one of those types of messages because they don't come from a real person. And the only way to actually influence them is for them to know the people in their district, know and see you at the State House where you talk to them directly. So we ended up, you know, basically going to lobby Springfield every 6 weeks. And, like, stalking our legislators at churches and everywhere else to get to know them personally. So, anyway, but at the same time, I just feel like there's this kind of tension with us and other people because we're sort of working with the government, you know, to reform the prison versus doing that kind of really way more aggressive disobedience.
I think everybody,
Yeah, but it's all technical. And that's because that's who our decision makers are.
But I think, I mean, that's also a really good example of working within the system and keeping within that system until it's reached where you want to get to.
Right.
And I mean, maybe that also brings up the question about the limiting digital or online activities and whether that makes them less effective or more effective when you're talking about the kind of scope you can have with a digital platform. But is that kind of scope and analysis that somehow obliterate any actual effect?
Well, I would say that in the best gestures that I think I've encountered that have these kind of expected or desired outcomes in terms of policy change on multiple levels was an action that Electronic Disturbance Theater participated in Germany in 2000, was the Lufthansa deportation class action. And in that particular action, there were multiple groups working with multiple tactics and strategies, but all coordinating with one another. So on the ground, you had basically 1968 activists working on prison politics who were not particularly adept or wanted to be adept with technology. You had the No Borders movement. You had conceptual artists from Cologne, and then you had a young group from the Chaos Computer Club, right? And basically they invited Electronic Disturbance Theater to travel around Germany and speak about how flood networks and this issue of transparency, working in terms of the streets, working in terms of the media, using digital technology to intervene on multiple scales. And basically what happened was that the Lufthansa had a government contract to deport people, and they would mummify them in the back of planes, and a number of them died along the way because they had these motorcycle helmets that were not fit for the people who were usually women or young people. And the outcome of this action was, number one, you had a group of young, hackers who never wanted to participate in something as transparent as floodnet, developing a floodnet-like action. Usually hackers up to that point, as far as I knew, were not very interested in the politics of the street. But these individuals started working on terms of street politics. Usually conceptual artists were not really involved with 68 political prison projects or hackers, right? So this group started doing interventions on Lufthansa, dressing up like Lufthansa pilots and stewardesses, and going to the airports and handing out deportation class information that looked like Lufthansa programming. Then activists from 68 took over the stockholders meeting of Lufthansa. The Chaos Computer Club did a virtual sit-in against the Lufthansa website, which went down. So all these things coordinated. The Lufthansa pilot union said they would never do another deportation class. The stockholders gave up the contract with the German government. And eventually there was a case wherein the 68 server administrator in 2004 was brought on cyber terrorism charges for the virtual sit-in that happened in 2000 in Frankfurt. The lower court said that it was a cyber crime and cyber terrorism and that he had to go to jail for 2 years or, no, I think 5 years and had to pay so many euros. But then the higher court in Frankfurt overturned that and said that electronic civil disobedience was part of the popular right of the German citizens. And so it was not cyber terrorism, cyber war, cyber crime. So I do think that there can be a mixture of tactical and strategic work. There can be coordination between conceptual projects, political projects, more elite hacker-like projects, and bring them to fruition in a way that allows us to take the larger aesthetic zones of each of those spaces and really begin to define particular outcomes that are often desired by activists or even artists in terms of policy changes. Does this mean that the German government did not hire other corporations to fly their deportees? Probably. They always have the funding to hire other airplane corporations or what have you. But nonetheless, out of this particular 2000 event, I did see, I thought, in a very positive way, the relationality begin to grow between what would be anonymous-like hackers, street politics, conceptual art, focusing on large-scale projects embedded within a society with some possible changes, however small. Anyway, I'll end there.
I also think, this is Carmen, sometimes anonymity is a real plus. In two cases that I can think of, one of them is where you have people with some sort of disability, and they actually cannot get out into the street, and the only way that they will be able to have any kind of action would be some sort of activist action where they are coming together online. There you can have a huge number because you tap into the network, and so you can have a global event where you have people with whatever disability, whatever it is that they want to have their demonstration about, and those people would largely remain anonymous because it is an online event. And the other one, I just forgot it. It's terrible. Oh, well, sorry.
I'm sure it's really interesting too. I have a really romantic question, despite talking about no romance a minute ago, which is about this idea of why we do what we do, given what we know. And I'm just wondering about this idea of maybe the capacity to imagine things otherwise. Is that why we're sort of doing this? I mean, if it's not just about direct action and direct results. I mean, I'm curious, Steve, about your discussion around, new frontiers or different frontiers, when certain ones feel closed, you find other angles and other spaces. To imagine things otherwise?
For extremely interested in the ideational. I mean, one of the major territories of resistance to us is manipulation of signs and symbols. And you can combine that with the idea that we are somewhat utopians. You know, we do believe that situations can be made better as we look over history. There's been worse times to live and there's been better times to live. And a lot of it has to do with how much autonomy and how much action people are putting into that moment in society. So, is it all going to be at the material plane? No. And especially now that we live in this technosphere that is so driven by the virtual that manipulation of signs and symbols becomes even more important. And to try and give people ideas of what could be, yes, we're totally interested in that. To try and to demonstrate that new types of social and political relationships and natural relationships are possible, of course we want to demonstrate that. Yeah, I think you summed up one of the elements that we do, one of the dimensions that critical art ensemble is really concerned with quite well.
Well, I would add that, I think we are anti-utopianism. And for me, while I do agree with Steve that it's a question of signs and the manipulation of signs in terms of the technosphere, for me, one of the major points of shift and grounding was the Zapatistas. There you had a community that was able to really create an alter zone, the different forms of life that were very materially based, that understood the coordinates of how to create a society on multiple scales, that was not, how should I say, fractured in its relationship either to the technosphere or to the ground, to the nature of growing. Talk about avant-garde, certainly the Zapatistas have created that space that continues to both question the kind of capitalist realisms and neoliberalisms that we often find ourselves in battle with. And so I do think that there is the space of thinking otherwise, of imagining otherwise. It may not be always visible, this exit, but I think, at least for me, the Zapatistas have been a grounding condition to really begin to think about what is possible outside of what seem to be the major command and control centers that we all function in, without fear of having those material structures of life unbind themselves completely from kind of the zones of the technosphere or the zones of communication or the manipulation of signs, and still have them extremely grounded. Anyway, so it's an anti-utopian position.
I have a really quick question that I kind of wondered during everybody's presentation, and it is, do you ever worry while you're developing these interesting, amazing technologies that they can be used, precisely against you? Like, for example, a gentrifier could say, we can gentrify here because you just moved this endangered species to this poor area, and, or if there's any other, I just was curious, because it seems like in all three cases we can think about people that are, have different goals than us using these technologies. And so do you ever have those fears? Do you have any examples of that?
Well, yeah, I have those fears, but I don't let them bother me. I kind of shake them off. Because look, I guarantee that, and this is why I tend to stay on the tactical rather than strategic side, is because it's all going to get recuperated. It's all going to be used against us, and we're in a kind of cycle, because most of the things that critical art takes and uses are already out there being used against us, and we say, okay, how do we reverse this? How do we make this object do the opposite of what it's designed to do? right? And, you know, and then it'll come back and it'll be taken back again. So this is kind of the necessity of nomadic movement in tacticality. So you're just kind of always moving ahead of the game because, yes, it's going to be recuperated. We are in the sphere of capitalism, and then one thing capitalism does great, you just can't critique it or criticize it, and that is to make something its own, to take something and deterritorialize it and recreate it again in its own image. So sure, I mean, any group tactic probably, you know, some will last a week, some will last a year, but sooner or later they will be a t-shirt. And that's why we move on.
But the thing is civil disobedience. Anybody can use civil disobedience, right? It's a burrito. Nazis can use civil disobedience. Yeah, that is, so that it's not just technology, but gestures that historically have existed, democracy, justice, all these things can be flipped over, can be used by those powers that be that are antagonistic to whatever is driving the project. The only time that I can, for instance, say where I thought it was interesting in terms of, say, electronic civil disobedience in terms of FloodNet. In one of the early days of FloodNet, when we did actions using the UC system computers against the Minutemen in the southern borders of California, was that the Minutemen said, well, we should do a virtual sit-in against the UC. And they looked at the code, which Carmin and Brett had developed, and then the Minutemen said, we're not going to use it because it has the stink of Mexicans on it. So there you have a case where a technology, or a code is seemingly open to anybody's use, that it wouldn't be used because it went against their own sort of ideological prejudices, that a Mexican had somehow bounded themselves to this code. So sometimes the makers themselves might put off those who would use it against them just because they are the makers. And it's already a tainted code.
Well, they're lost.
There was a case where code similar to FloodNet, basically denial of service, was used by the U.S. government. It was a countermeasure against one of the FloodNet actions where the guys decided to attack the Pentagon. The Pentagon didn't take that too lightly. They over-responded. And what they did was they had some hacker create software that would see the IP address of any computer that was participating in the FloodNet action, and then cause that particular computer to crash by opening up so many windows that it just used up the resources on that computer. So that is a case where it sort of describes what you're talking about, but it isn't. I mean, we weren't afraid that was going to happen, but it is a case where it did actually happen.
So, everybody, I'm going to have to go.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point.
Well, your son is still on the show anyway.
Yeah. He's tired of me and everything that I do right now.